so there wasn't ultimately a new big picture last week because things came up, and the thing that I can speak to non-obliquely while also stressing nothing else is bad, if that makes any sense, is that I'd since been fortunate enough to contribute another recent episode of Film Theory about the Falcon and the Winter Soldier. My initial plan was to do kind of a, hey, here's who all these people are supposed to be, old-timey, comics are weird type episode around the general known and unknown cast of characters and that, because as it turns out, since there's really only two Captain America enemies anyone has heard of, and they killed both of them off already, the Captain America MCU Disney Plus spin-off show is pulling from some pretty obscure places to round out the roster of a 6-episode miniseries. Trick is, with fewer episodes and significantly less pretense toward a mystery show structure than WANDAVISION had, even only one episode in, they'd already kind of dropped and teased a ton of the stuff I'd outlined and separated out into confirmed and maybes, and by the time the rewrites were done, a couple of the biggest maybes weren't anymore. Which is good for the show and better for fans watching, since this is getting pretty cool and interesting, but not as great for the economics of coverage model that used to have more lead time on these things. But survival of the fittest, we shall adapt.
Mankind has evolved since then.
Yes, into us.
And speaking of adaptation, okay, so a fair criticism of this show is that I sometimes bury the lead when it comes to anything topical because I'm old and I write essay style, so building to a denouement is just kinda how I know to do it, but in this case I know the point does need to hit up front, if only for the setup, and where's he going with this, so let's just set the table right now. The first episode of Falcon and Winter Soldier managed to stir up a somewhat unexpected somehow amount of early controversy because a certain amount of people were, again, somehow caught off guard that this show, where at least one of the storylines is about a black guy and a white guy in conflict over which of them deserves to inherit the legacy of being the symbol of America itself. Seriously, nobody saw that coming?
Mention it because I don't think it's gonna matter.
Oh, it's gonna matter. It's gonna matter.
Episode 2 then effectively confirmed 1 week later, oh, they were going there, via the introduction of actor Carl Lumbly as a character from the Captain America comics named Isaiah Bradley, whom you've either heard of and immediately know why that's probably important, or you've never heard of, in which case... Originating in what's still probably the darkest and most controversial Captain America story ever published as part of the mainline Marvel Comics continuity, 2003's Truth, Red, White, and Black by Robert Morales and Kyle Baker, Bradley was presented as a Black World War II enlistee whose story was meant to offer a parallel within the Marvel Universe canon for the Black community experience in earlier 20th century America, specifically in regard to the history of military service and real-life human medical experimentation that are key aspects in the more straightforward, heroic World War II narratives associated with the previously established Steve Rogers Captain America stories. Over the course of 7 issues, we learned that in a scenario that deliberately invoked the dark history of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, the Army secretly tested prototypes of what would later become the infamous Super Soldier Serum on Black World War II recruits before starting what became the official Captain America program, i.e. where Steve Rogers gained his superpowers and became Captain America, killing 300 plus men and then covering it up but semi-successfully achieving the first prototype super soldier in Isaiah Bradley, whose very existence the government also attempted to suppress knowledge of, and while he ultimately performed heroics of his own accord, was even imprisoned for a time to hide the truth from the public and from Steve Rogers, who learned of this injustice and tried to make amends to the now elderly and infirm Bradley in the present. Bradley has remained a presence in the Marvel Universe and the Captain America franchise since then, with his grandson Eli later becoming one of the Young Avengers as the Patriot. Given that the already pushing it time skip between World War II and Truth, Red, White, and Black's present dating of 2003 at the time has now enlarged nearly 20 years, it can be assumed that the version of Isaiah Bradley Lumbly is portraying will have a somewhat different origin. The series didn't give him a full MCU backstory as of episode 2, but it does offer a few details, most notably that his existence was known to Bucky Barnes, and that the government at some point used him to thwart the Winter Soldier version of Bucky during the Korean War.
We heard whispers he was on the peninsula. So the U.S. military dropped me behind the line to go deal with him. Took half that metal arm I see. He's managed to grow it back.
But also further describes his being imprisoned for 30 years instead of the 15 from the comics, and that people from both the Army and Hydra were regularly coming to take his blood while he was captive.
Running tests. Taking my blood. Coming into my cell. Even your people weren't done with me.
Now that's clearly an important detail in the context of this story for the series and potentially the rest of the bigger MCU franchise. Even if Bradley's origin had been pushed ahead by chronological necessity to where it would no longer be possible for him to have been a test subject prior to creating the original Super Soldier Serum, it doesn't mean he couldn't have been part of a similar experiment to create more of it, as it's already been established that a lot of people have tried to do that over the course of the cinematic universe backstory, and that this is responsible for, among other things, the creation of the Hulk and the Winter Soldier himself. It's also a plot point in this specific series, and in fact the mystery history of where various people are suddenly acquiring super soldier-style abilities is what leads Sam Wilson and Bucky to Isaiah in the first place. Also, the bootleg serum is supposedly being moved around by someone called the Power Broker, which is another comic book reference, and the Korean War reference is possibly teeing up the involvement of another long-rumored character called the Blue Marvel, but we only have so much time here. To that point, even though not explicitly spelled out in the series yet, the implication at least is that the new serum may have been derived from the blood Bradley says was taken from him during his political imprisonment. But an even bigger and significantly darker implication, with this having gone on for more than decades of his life, is that it's possible that some or even most of the various Make More Super Soldiers experiments that we've heard about as parts of the various MCU backstories and mythologies over the previous films and series were, knowingly or not, conducted using unjustly taken biological samples from a single individual black political prisoner, and who knows what else it would have been used for. Now that would be a horrifyingly grim new layer of moral darkness were it only the background for a Marvel sci-fi espionage show, but just like the comics version of Bradley's backstory was grounded in the history of a very real, notorious example of black Americans being used for medical experimentation by their government, this hypothetical version sounded, at least to me, the moment he talked about his blood being taken, like an allusion to the story of Henrietta Lacks. Which, if you've not heard this story before, was a black woman who died from cancer in a segregated hospital in 1951. As was legally allowable in that period, cancer cells were harvested specifically from a tumor on her cervix for analysis without consent, acknowledgement, or compensation to herself or her family, and these cells were later found to be especially efficient at replicating in a laboratory environment. This led to additional harvesting and ultimately the so-designated HeLa cancer cell cultures becoming one of the earliest and far most widely distributed and utilized cultures of its type for cancer cell research in the world, including the first cancer cells to be cloned. But while medical and commercial science benefited from this, her descendants were not only never informed or compensated, certain researchers seeking to conduct more specific tests used the availability of Lack's documented connection to the HeLa cell line to track down family physicians and hospitals treating members of the Lacks family and request extra medically unnecessary blood samples from them for use in research without explaining the reason for this. Now, if you hadn't heard that story before, when the white-hot anger subsides, you can learn more about it from the Adam Curtis documentary The Way of All Flesh, Rebecca Skloot's 2010 book The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, and the 2017 drama film of the same name with Oprah Winfrey. So, to me, this is pretty interesting, both on a that would be an unusual place for a Marvel thing to go level, and also just an even if it's just a low-key reference, it's interesting that it gives me an excuse to put something actually important about science, history, medical ethics, whatever, in a show this week. But even apart from this specific plot thread, I'm always interested to see this kind of material in these kinds of productions because I'm a big supporter of the idea that you can do entertaining work that's also meaningful work, and Falcon and the Winter Soldier is clearly aiming to, regardless of whether or not their angle in this subplot is to make Isaiah Bradley the MCU Henrietta Lacks, because the scene immediately after this features our second incident in as many episodes, demonstrating that even the Avengers still deal with racism in their daily lives.
Sir, just calm down.
I am calm. What do you want? We're just standing here
Just
talking.
give him your ID.
No, I'm not giving him shit. We're just talking.
Hey, look, is this guy bothering
No,
you?
he's not bothering me. Do you know who this is?
Oh, God.
So it's a little disheartening to see a lot of the reaction to the series working very hard to spotlight, hey, we're doing something big with the lore, maybe, but it's about this systemic concept, still being framed around whether or not the focus on the serum and the powered persons and the history of both the real world and the Marvel world is a clue to how and when the X-Men or whoever are finally going to get announced for the MCU for real, because someone took a set photo and it seems to reference a made-up country that was mostly in those comics when it was a thing at all.
I am so tired.
On the other hand, how much does it really matter in perspective, right? This is meant to be entertainment primarily, so as long as you're not really being an ass to the creators or being an ass to people who disagree with you when it doesn't go your way, there isn't really a wrong way to approach it as entertainment. Do your thing. Sure, I don't know that anyone can disagree about personal approaches to enjoyment or lack thereof. But I do also think it kinda sucks, for lack of a better descriptive term, when people making this stuff do go that extra mile to be interesting and compelling, have some depth, explore meaningful concepts, whatever, while also achieving that primary entertainment goal. As we talked about up front, succeeding at it and the acknowledgement either earns them backlash for trying, or in some ways, even worse, isn't acknowledged at all to begin with. Like, obviously, the people behind WandaVision had their fun joking around with their premise and thus with the viewers, but you also have to assume they were relieved when most of the overall responses to the conclusion of the show in total were about how well they did or didn't land their main genre deconstruction as trauma allegory thesis, rather than whether or not they teased enough future projects or didn't leave enough room for the X-Men or whoever to show up. And in the case of Falcon and Winter Soldier so far, and definitely the potential angles of the Bradley family and their place in Marvel, maybe future MCU narrative, there is a certain level of extra, oh come on guys, echoing in my subconscious when I remember that for decades, the default rationale and response that every Marvel nerd, myself no exception, knew to yeah-but naysayers who scoffed at the idea that stuff like X-Men was popular or worth looking at beyond, oh, kick ass, that one dude can make knives pop out of his fists, was, actually, it's also a poignant metaphor for the duality of reactions to racism, bigotry, and the fight for civil rights. So, thank you. But now a Marvel production goes and does a whole subplot of a whole series that all but sends up that floodlight announcing, hey, here's a racism, bigotry, and civil rights storyline, not a metaphor, the spelled out and based on real history upfront plot, and so far way too much of the response to it has remained focused on, oh, okay, that's interesting, but what does it mean about when the Knife Fist Man is gonna get here? And I'm not saying that's the worst oversight or lack of perspective in the world, but I do think maybe if the people telling these kinds of stories are going to do the work at telling them better, as much fun as Easter eggs and clues and references and continuity stuff can be, maybe those of us reporting on it, reacting to it, covering it, can try to cover it better as well. I'm Bob, and that's the big picture.